Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Ian Rubinoff and I am the Director of Global Technical Services for Highline International. It is my great pleasure today to give a presentation on Korea layer data analysis run by our Vision Egg program. Highline has been running a commercial layer database for over 10 years now. And the strongest focus really has been in the last few years as we try to track and understand how layers perform and how to get the best performance out of Highline genetics. The more data that we have in our system, the better we are able to make an analysis and the more accurate the analysis can be. Before we get started working with the data, I want to go through and explain a few of the terms. The first one that I want to talk about is the difference between median and mean. The median value is the middle value, and you can see here on the left-hand side that we have all of the values ranked from the highest to the lowest. And the median value is just the value that's in the middle. The mean or average value here on the right, you can see we have all of the values are scrambled up. We add them all together and divide by 9. You can see that there's a difference between the two values of 258.1 for the median and 256.7 for the mean. Statistically, we feel that the median can work a little bit better because this can help ignore some of the outliers in the system. Some of the other terms that we're going to use in this presentation include the difference, which is just the difference from the Korea median minus the world median. We'll talk about percentile, which is the percentage of data above or below the data point. For instance, quartile 1 is the value at which 25% of the data set is lower and 75% of the data set is higher. We want mortality and feed conversion to be towards Q1. We already discussed median. So now for quartile 3. This is the value at which 75% of the data is lower and 25% of the data is higher. We want eggs per hen housed and hen day percent to be towards Q3. Egg weight, body weight, and feed consumption have different preferences around the world, so really we look for the comparison. We also will talk about focal flocks, which in this case will be all of the Korean flocks, and comparison flocks, where we have run 2 different comparisons for the world and for Japan. The comparison are the flocks that we are comparing the data to, and the focal flocks will be for our target audience. For our first analysis, I wanted to show a snapshot of Korean data versus all the data from Asia, Europe, Latin America, and Oceania. Please note that there are 18 flocks included at 60 weeks, and overall we have about 24 flocks in our system from Korea. And this changes as the flocks get older, of course. For our comparison flocks, we have over 600 young flocks. We have over 440 flocks at 60 weeks of age. And we have over 270 flocks at 70 weeks of age. All of these flocks are only for the first cycle. So even if a flock is molted, for this analysis, we only counted the first cycle. a few things to look at here. First of all, we can see in the column that says Korea median, this is the median value for each one of the metrics on the left-hand side. And the percentile tells us where we rank in the world. At 2.9% mortality, we're at the 62nd percentile. So this is a little bit worse than the global median of 2.4% mortality, about 0.5% worse. However, for eggs per hen housed, the Korea median is 257.4, which is in the 52nd 0.4 percentile. This means that the median flock is a little bit better than the median flock around the world. At 70 weeks, we see similar trends. The mortality median at 4.5% is a little bit higher than the rest of the world. And the eggs per hen housed are more or less about the same. Now, let's look at the whole life of the flock. This is for the hen day percent. And if we look at the black line, which is the median for Korea, and the range for the rest of the world, that the line of the blue is for the 90th percentile flocks, and the edge of the red is for the 10th percentile of the rest of the world flocks. The white line in the middle is the median for the rest of the world. The most interesting things that we see about this chart here is that the Korean flocks come into peak more or less the same as the rest of the world. But the peak is just a little bit lower. We catch up to the peak after 25 weeks, and then the persistency falls a little bit further down. This tells us that for highline brown flocks in Korea, we have some opportunity to catch up in persistency when we compare to the rest of the world. When we look at our eggs per hen housed for Korea, we can see that it's that middle peak area that we're able to catch up. We come in very close in eggs at 30 weeks, identical at 40 weeks, and then a little bit ahead at 50 and 60 weeks, and then we fall a little bit behind because of persistency at 70 and 80 weeks. This is looking at egg weight. Now, one of the interesting things about egg weight is that around the world, we have many different preferences. For some countries, they want a 58 to 60 gram egg. For other countries, they want a 66 to 70 gram egg. And so the management practices and nutrition will change depending on what egg size you need, as well as the genetics, because we have different male lines we use around the world in order to help enhance or lower the egg size, depending on what the country needs. When we look at Korean egg size compared to the rest of the world, it is remarkably close to the median. We can see here that the median Korea flock reaches 60 gram eggs around 28 weeks of age, and then stays around 62 grams until after 60 weeks, where there's a slow increase up towards 64 grams. Now let's look at body weights. In Korea, it looks like there's an excellent job rearing pullets. And one thing that's very interesting when we've run this data is looking at the really large body weights that we have in Korea. Normally, my goal is to reach 2.0 kilograms between 30 and 35 weeks of age, similar to what the median of the world would be. And I don't like to have hens too much heavier than 2 kilograms to 2.05 kilograms, with a maximum of 2.1. Brown hens that are too heavy can end up with peritonitis or other disease challenges, and we can lose some efficiency. However, we see that the body weights in Korea are some of the higher in the world, and this could be an opportunity for us to improve some performance. Now looking at feed consumption, we can see that the feed consumption is quite a bit higher in Korea compared to other areas of the world. Now certainly we have a pretty big range. For free-range flocks in Northern Europe that are going outside when it's cold outside in the winter, we see much higher feed consumptions, and this would certainly account for some of our 125 grams. In hot and humid climates, like Colombia, we can see that there's a lower feed consumption, usually towards 105 to 110 grams. The Korean feed consumption of around 120 grams is certainly in about the 75th percentile for the world, which is, as long as it works for everyone economically, is okay. And we also could look at some opportunities to improve our feed consumption. And lastly, for this comparison, we have our mortality data. We see that Korea flocks have very similar mortality to most of the world, going until about 60 weeks of age. And then after 60 weeks of age, we have a little bit of an increase in mortality compared to the rest of the world. Whether this is a disease issue or some nutritional challenges at this age is worth investigating. So, quick analysis for Korea versus the world. For mortality, it starts similar and ends up a little bit higher after 65 weeks. For eggs per hen housed, it is very close to the median, and Korea does a very nice job with highline brown egg production. For hen day percent, we see some opportunity to improve our peaks and also improve our persistency a little bit. For hen weight, we see birds are getting heavier than most of the world, and this potentially is hurting a little bit of our persistency. For egg weight, we see this is very close to the world median. However, if we want a little bit bigger egg size, there are certainly some management and nutritional aspects that we can work with. And for feed, we see that we're 7 to 10 grams higher than most of the rest of the world. For a second data analysis today, I wanted to discuss the comparison between Korea and Japan. The reason that I decided to use Japan as a comparison is that, number one, there is a geographic similarity and very similar temperature profiles between the two countries. Number two, we both have brown hens in both locations for the highline brown. Number three is we have a lot of data from Japan. As you see here, we have 159 flocks at 60 weeks of age, and we have a lot more for the younger flocks. And number four, there are some interesting differences that can be explained by the difference in management. So I think that this will be very instructive to help us understand the difference in similar genetics, similar environment, but different management styles. Again, it must be reminded that all of the Korea data is exactly the same as our previous analysis. The only thing that changed is the background data or comparison data. So as we can see here, the Korean flocks come in to lay a little bit earlier than the Japanese flocks and do not persist quite as well. One thing that is interesting is many Japanese producers molt a lot of their flocks. So we see a big drop off in the number of flocks after 70 weeks because this is the age where most producers will molt. In terms of eggs per hen housed, both because of the earlier production and even with some persistency and differences in livability, we can see that Korea has a little bit better eggs per hen housed than the Japanese flocks. And at 70 weeks, we're a bit behind, but for the few flocks that made it out to 80 weeks, the Korean flocks have pulled ahead of the Japanese flocks. Egg size differences are a bit different. First of all, the Japanese market values a smaller egg. The Japanese market really enjoys a 60-gram egg to 61-gram egg. And we can see that the Korean flocks reach 60 grams about 4 to 5 weeks earlier than the median Japanese flock. And the egg size stays a bit higher until the end of the flock. Body weights are much heavier in Japan than the rest of the world as well. Although we can see the body weights are pretty similar up until about 30 weeks, and then post 30 weeks, the Korean flocks end up being a little bit heavier, but not nearly as much as that 100 to 110 gram difference that we see compared to the rest of the world. The biggest difference that we see between Korean flocks and Japanese flocks is in the feed consumption. We see the similarity in egg numbers and a little bit difference in egg size. The biggest difference here is in the feed consumption. And this is one of the areas I wanted to investigate a little bit further, because we have very similar production, but obviously a very different approach to feeding. And I think this is a great example of the environment effect, where we can have the same bird in two different environments being fed two different ways and still end up with very similar levels of production. It's not to say one area works better than the other, but that we can achieve the same results with some different ideas. And this hopefully will allow us to explore some new ways of managing or new ways of feeding the highline brown as we move forward. When we look at mortality, we can see that the Korean flocks move a little bit higher in mortality compared to the Japanese flocks. And again, the data after 70 weeks starts to get a little bit messy as birds start going into molt. But overall, this is another opportunity for us to explore how we can lower the mortality after 60 weeks of age. For the analysis summary of Korea versus Japan, for mortality, this is quite similar to the world comparison, and we see higher mortality after 65 weeks compared to both Japan and the world. For eggs per hen housed, we see a little bit better production, but this is probably due to the earlier production compared to the median Japanese flock. And as we said, for hen day percent, we come into lay earlier, but we lose some persistency later in lay. I think by helping to manage the body weights, we can not only bring down our mortality, but I think we can help boost our production a little bit. So this might be a win-win. The egg weights are reached you reach 60 grams, both earlier than Japan, and you persist a little bit higher. However, this is very dependent on the egg size requirements for the Korean market. And for feed, again, we're about 7 to 10 grams higher than the Japanese flocks compared to the rest of the world. So overall, thank you for being with us for this data analysis. So for some quick summary and suggestions or recommendations, for mortality, we need to understand and minimize the later mortality in our flocks. For eggs per hen housed and hen day percent, overall, our egg numbers are good. However, I think we can improve a little bit, especially if we reduce our later mortality. For our hen weights, the ideal highline brown flock should end up between 2 and 2.05 kilograms, and I would like to see if we can try to achieve that. I really like the growth through the peak performance, and then after 30 weeks, try to manage the body weights a little bit more. For our egg weights, our lower egg weights are not likely due to body weight. Instead, we really need to look at our nutrition and our lighting programs. We know genetically that the highline brown is capable of achieving egg weights anywhere up to 66 grams if we need her to. So with this flexibility, a lot is left to the management and the nutrition. And certainly, KPTS and highline can both help you try to achieve your egg weight goals. And then for feed consumption. The feed consumption in Korea is really the highest in the world for caged layers. The only other area that would have similar feed consumptions is in Northern Europe, specifically UK, France, and Netherlands, where we see a lot of open-sided free-range houses where birds are running around in 1 and 2 degree temperatures because of the open range concept that we are working with there. High feed consumption is certainly okay as long as the birds are getting all the nutrients that they need and that we're not losing out because we're formulating for a higher ration. The combination of high feed consumption, but is still a challenge with egg weights with some customers, indicates we may need to work a little bit with the nutrition. And of course, doing an analysis to see if lowering our feed consumption by 7 to 10 grams, but by feeding a higher density diet, if this is worth it economically. Because ultimately, we're all here to try to understand how we can get the best profit from all of our flocks. Thank you very much for your attention, and please consider sending your data to KPTS so you can also be included in the Vision Egg benchmarking program. Thank you for your time today, and have a great evening.